Most people don't know that Kosovo is the most pro-US country in the world, arguably, and even the most pro-EU country in the world as well.
It's something that we wear as a badge of honor, and we see ourselves as an extension of American values. If Russia were to respect the values based on which NATO was built, then obviously I assume that also the position of NATO towards Russia would change.
President Trump has been extremely critical of the EU. He's been critical of NATO.
The United States has given a historic contribution to a Europe whole, free and at peace. It's a contribution that no one can ever erase. The United States has every right to also speak up when there are certain things that they believe are not based on the values that they trust and the beliefs that they share. I don't think Europe can make it without the support of the United States.
And do you have any lines of communication with President Vučić of Serbia?
Often.
Do you speak to him often, maybe on the call, on phone calls?
That has not happened yet, not because Kosovo didn't want to, but quite the opposite. This country and this nation has played a historical role in defending what we call Western civilizations.
So I just had a conversation with the president of the youngest country in Europe, the most pro-US nation in the world, the most pro-EU country in the world, a country that was part of a bigger country that was home to the first ever NATO military campaign. The conversation gives the audience a different outlook on what NATO stands for, what USAID has done in the world, not only the bad, but also the good, and a recipient of the benefits of US leadership. I think this gives you all another perspective on the world, and a very important perspective nonetheless, especially when it comes to NATO and what's happening in Ukraine. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. A lot of people in the world don't know where Kosovo even is on the map. It's a very small country. It's the youngest country in Europe. But it's also, it's been a lot of things that have happened in that region have been controversial on the international stage, have also played a pretty big role when it comes to geopolitical tensions, especially when it comes to Russia, the US, even China. What I've been fascinated by is that most people don't know that Kosovo is the most pro-US country in the world, arguably. And even, I just found out when I was having a discussion with your team, the most pro-EU country in the world as well. And the reason I said earlier, I made a joke that it's more pro-US than the US itself, is that your chief of staff was telling me is that people in Kosovo don't care if it's conservatives or the Conservative Party or the liberals that are in power. The US is the US, because the bombing in 1999 was under Bill Clinton in support of Kosovo. And when Declaration of Independence happened in 2008 was under President Bush. So that's why in Kosovo, you really don't differentiate between the two parties. It's also, Kosovo was part of Yugoslavia, which was home to the first ever military campaign by NATO in 1995 in Bosnia. And obviously in 1999, it was NATO's first and one of very few times they've conducted a military campaign without the approval of the UN, which we'll be talking about as well. And as I said earlier, it is the youngest country in Europe. So it's just been, for such a small country, such a small population, it's a fascinating and also heartbreaking history for Yugoslavia as a whole, and specifically Kosovo. My first question is the history of Yugoslavia as well. I want to start there, but very briefly for the audience to give them context. Can you tell us more about Yugoslavia as a country, and then how it kind of broke away into multiple countries in the 90s, led to the first Yugoslav war, and then Kosovo declared independence in 1999. Can you maybe walk us through of how Kosovo was part of Yugoslavia, and how that why and how it became an independent country in 2008? A sovereign country.
Absolutely. First of all, it's a great pleasure to have you here and to be able to talk to you about Kosovo, about our country, about our people's history, but most importantly also about the potential we have for the future. Now, the Republic of Kosovo, as you rightly pointed out, is the youngest country in Europe. And it has the youngest population in Europe as well, with more than 50% of our people under 25 in the aging continent of Europe. That is quite the potential. So we're the country of youth, practically. A lot of the spirit you will see during your visit in Kosovo, and that reflects great hopes, but at the same time, a great future for our country. Now, of course, Kosovo does have a very painful history. I just came back from 2 villages that I visited today, Krusha e Madhe and Krusha e Vogël. Hundreds of young men, women, even pregnant women, children, elderly were killed, massacred, civilians, in just, a few hours indiscriminately. And then they were burned down because the intention of the Milosevic regime at that time was clear to wipe us out from the face of the earth. So he was not sufficed by just kicking us out from the country, from these lands that we've been inhabiting for millennia. But they wanted to make sure that they destroy these people. And after burning these people down, they took their corpses and they put them in massive graves in Serbia. Many of them are still missing, are forcibly disappeared. And you can imagine the pain of the mothers where they don't have a place where they can lay a flower on the grave of their child. There's no pain larger than this. So the pains of the war are still very much present. Nevertheless, I was looking at the kids in these villages, brilliant kids, young girls and young boys who grew up without a father, who grew up without their parents. The entire village practically is full of kids that grew up without their parents. And I was looking at these women, unbreakable women who, against all odds, managed to not just survive, but also to thrive. So, as I often say, the story of Kosovo is truly a story of survivors who thrived. Now, historically speaking, and getting back to your question, now, Kosovo was illegally annexed by Serbia more than a century ago. But then, of course, after Yugoslavia was created, Kosovo was a constituent unit of Yugoslavia with equal rights like all of the other constitutive units. Now, according to the 1974 Constitution of Yugoslavia, if there would be a dissolution of Yugoslavia, each of these constitutive units would earn the right to self-determination and to determine their own fate. Now, how it came to the dissolution of this state, which, as you know, was very successful economically and internationally, is because in 1989, the Milosevic regime wanted to destroy everyone who was different from him from an ethnical point of view. So initially, he started wars against Slovenia and Croatia in 1991, as you know. Then they won the war, but also they became independent states. And then the horrible war against Bosnia-Herzegovina that escalated to genocide with 8,000 young boys and men killed in Srebrenica in just a day. And then, of course, there were attempts against North Macedonia and other countries in the region, and that escalated to the war in Kosovo in 1999. But before the war happened in Kosovo against the people of Kosovo, because we didn't start the war, practically we were sitting in our own homes. We were living in our own homes, and we were attacked by the Yugoslav military and police. But before the war in 98-99, there was a 10-year apartheid-like regime. So practically everyone of my generation that you will meet from Kosovo, we grew up as children of war that ended up becoming refugees. But before the war, we grew up in a country where we did not have the right to education. So just because we were of the Albanian nation, although we were more than 92% in this country, we were not allowed to go to school. Our parents were not allowed to go to work. We were not allowed to play a basketball game or play music. We did not have any of the cultural or economic rights that are internationally recognized and in international conventions to which Yugoslavia at that time and Serbia were a party. We did not have the right to freedom and the right to live, because Kosovo has the highest number of political prisoners of any other country in former Yugoslavia, and people were indiscriminately killed. So we were kicked out of our schools. We were forced to go to separate private houses that were turned into schools and build a parallel system through which we continued our education. So this apartheid-like system was legislated in acts that were signed by Milosevic at that time. So it was not just the political will or some political action. These were also legislative and government executive action by Milosevic at that time to stripe us off of any basic human right and fundamental freedom. And of course, that escalated with the removal of the autonomy rights in 1989. So for 10 years, we lived under an apartheid-like regime. And then in 1999, the war in Kosovo started, which escalated to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And just a little element, because I know a lot of people talk about how, well, Milosevic just wanted the land. Let me just give you an example. If you go around Kosovo, if you visit even the tiniest village, they will tell you of the biggest massacres that happened in their country, in their own tiny village. So this was a war against innocent women and children. We have the highest number of children killed per capita of any war in former Yugoslavia. About 20,000 women were raped, which was used as a tool of war by the Milosevic regime because they wanted to create intergenerational harm. And of course, about 13,000 people were killed in a matter of months. 128,000 houses were entirely destroyed, including cultural heritage, which dates back to thousands and thousands of years ago, because as you know, we are the direct descendants of Illyrians. So just a few kilometers from Pristina, if you go, you will see archaeological facts about this nation living here for thousands and thousands of years before. But there was a clear intention by the Milosevic regime, and not just against Kosovo, by all means, but also against Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia and others, to wipe us off from the face of the earth. And thankfully, democracies around the world came to our rescue, led by the United States, and saved our lives. So it's only normal, I would say, that Kosovo today is and proudly so, the most pro-American nation on earth. Something that we wear as a badge of honor. More than 97% of our people are pro-America. They trust in American leadership. And we see ourselves as an extension of American values. And as you said, this has not been an issue of partisanship, because we were blessed with bipartisan support throughout history. And we really look forward to working with the current administration to see how we can deepen these relations in the future.
I'm really excited to continue this discussion because I've been very critical of NATO's involvement, especially when it comes to the Ukraine war, which we'll get to later on, a lot of their actions in the Middle East. But I've also seen, as President Kagame of Rwanda, I've also seen what happens when world powers, turn a blind eye to atrocities. What happened in Rwanda, 1 million people dying in 100 days, is beyond heartbreaking. And NATO's involvement in 1995 had the UN support because of what was happening there. And in Kosovo, from what I understand, NATO got involved to prevent a humanitarian crisis. That was the argument they made. And some countries were very critical of that decision. That decision led to the bombing of Serbia, which is also I've been to Serbia. I've been there once before, 12 years ago. And it's also heartbreaking to see the damage they went through because of the bombing and because of the decisions Milosevic as a president has taken. So the argument that you're making is that sometimes NATO is necessary and there's a lot of good that it brings to the world. And Kosovo is an example of one of those decisions. Can I explain to the audience on your thoughts on NATO as an organization, and when do you determine an organization like NATO, a military organization, an alliance, should get involved? Because there's a lot of times right now in Africa, one could look at Africa, what's happening in Congo. NATO could prevent the atrocities that are happening there. and you look at what happened in the Middle East, I think NATO's led to a lot of destruction, the expansion eastwards towards Russia. What's your thoughts on NATO in general as an alliance and all their military actions beyond Kosovo in the last few years?
As you said, this needs to be a case-by-case determination. When it comes to the NATO intervention in 1999, the fact there was a lack of the UN Security Council decision in no way makes the NATO intervention illegal, because the UN Charter clearly points out that those rules in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter determine the role of the UN, the military role of the United Nations. NATO is a separate organization. So we're not talking about a UN military involvement. We're not talking about, bombings from the United Nations. We're talking about a separate military alliance, military political alliance, which is NATO, which has its own rules, including rules on self-defense. But even if we look at the UN Charter, when looking at legal documents, it's always important to not read articles separately and always start with the very preamble and the aim of that certain document. What was the intention of the drafters? Why was the UN created in the first place? As you know, after the Second World War, what created the United Nations was countries getting together to stop human suffering. That was the centerpiece of the aim that created the United Nations, to stop human suffering. And then they talk about principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty and so on and so forth, all of which are subordinate to the basic principle of stopping human suffering. So you're right when you say that we see so much suffering around the world, and unfortunately we see zero action from the UN, most times because of the veto that is used by some countries. However, in the case of Kosovo, one, you will see that many of the leadership of NATO at that time said that they were acting to stop an ongoing genocide. Now, stopping or preventing genocide is an obligation in international law. We lawyers call it an erga omnes obligation. That means an obligation of all. So each sovereign country, each member of the United Nations has an international law obligation to prevent genocide when they see clear signs that there is an intention to commit it, which they clearly saw in the actions of Milosevic, also because of what he did in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the other wars that he waged. So there was a international law obligation for Western powers, in this case, countries that truly take their international law obligations seriously, to prevent the furthering of the genocide that was ongoing against the people of Kosovo. Otherwise, we would risk another Rwanda, we would risk another Srebrenica, Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the impact that NATO's intervention in Kosovo has had, the positive impact, goes way beyond simply the people of Kosovo surviving, being saved, and getting their freedom and independence. It's a lesson for countries around the world that the territory exists for the people, not vice versa. And to quote an international judge from Brazil who worked at the International Court of Justice, he said, "No country can invoke the principle of territorial integrity or sovereignty to kill the people who live in that territory. You're supposed to use those principles to defend the people, not the other way around, not to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide against them," which is what Milosevic did. According to the International Court of Justice, you lose the right to invoke the principles of territorial integrity or sovereignty if you're killing your people by using these principles, because that even goes against the UN Charter, which was created to protect people, rather than some abstract notions which are not there to make you a dictator, but a savior, a protector of the people who live in the territory that you're a president of. So, in terms of international law, the ICJ back in 1999 refused Serbia's cases against the United States, against Spain, against Belgium, against Netherlands, and against many other countries for the NATO bombings. So Serbia lost those cases. If there was anything illegal in terms of NATO's intervention, obviously the International Court of Justice would have decided in favor of Serbia, but no, they rejected Serbia's claim when it comes to the NATO intervention. So it was absolutely a just action that has had a very positive impact worldwide, because the message that is sent to leaders around the world is that the respect for basic human rights and freedoms and the respect for international law are fundamental. And if you violate them, especially if you violate them for a very long time against the people who live in that country, then of course you cannot invoke the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty any longer. So these are all arguments that show that NATO's intervention was not only just but also legal, coupled by the case of the International Court of Justice, which Serbia lost against the NATO countries, and also the fact that NATO was acting based on the principle of preemptive self-defense. Because, look, just let me explain. You've traveled from Serbia to Kosovo, right? If you start driving, in 30 minutes, you will be in North Macedonia. In 1 hour, you will be in Albania. In less than 4 hours, you will be in Bulgaria. In 4 hours, you will be in Greece. All of them are NATO members. So NATO at that time, also based on their public statements, was clarifying how this was an imminent threat on NATO member states. And it was a matter of days that the war would spread to countries like Albania, North Macedonia, Italy, Greece. And if NATO was not to act, this would have been a war on the European continent. So this was a preemptive collective self-defense. So they stopped a much bigger war on the European continent. And that is another benefit of that intervention, because it was limited to Kosovo without allowing Milosevic to spread the war to the entire continent, which would have had catastrophic impact.
So on the self-defense argument, I think it's important to draw a distinction between doing the right thing and doing something in self-defense. So, for example, if NATO got involved in Rwanda, it would have done, in 1994, would have done something incredible for humanity and stopped potentially a million people from dying. But it wouldn't be in self-defense. Hard to make that argument. I think making the argument that Serbia's attack on Kosovo, Milosevic did not want Kosovo to declare independence. And also, of course, the ethnic cleansing that you were referring to, and he didn't want Albanians in Kosovo, he wanted Serb to have power. But I think his focus was Kosovo, was not a NATO member. So would you say it's also a fair counter-argument just to the defensive nature of it, that it wasn't really as defensive as some of the other involvement that we've seen in Kosovo in the Middle East, NATO in the Middle East, for example?
The difference between Kosovo and Rwanda was because Kosovo was very close, just a few hours away from NATO territory. And clearly, NATO leadership at that time, based on their own evaluation of what was going on in the ground, publicly said that there was an imminent threat to NATO member states. And if they do not act, the war would spread immediately. We cannot say that in the case of Rwanda, which I agree with you. It would have been an incredible support of humanity if they had acted. However, Rwanda is not close to any NATO member state, so there was not that risk of the war spreading to NATO territory so imminently as it was the case with Kosovo. So, of course, I'm not saying that Kosovo was NATO territory. Obviously, we're aiming to join NATO. Hopefully, that will happen very fast. However, look, international law has evolved. We're not talking about the same international law that existed in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s. We're talking about contemporary international law. We're talking about principles such as responsibility to protect. We're talking about the principle of preemptive self-defense, all of which are new principles of international law, and they have been used. Now, there's a question on where they've had a positive impact and where they haven't. So if we look now what happened in the Middle East and what was the result,
what are your thoughts on that?
Obviously, it's completely different. I mean, first of all, when it comes to the Middle East, I think most of those decisions were made were not necessarily well-informed decisions. And as we can see, the result was not as positive as the result in Kosovo. There's still so much unrest, so much lack of stability, a lot of wars still happening there, and people are suffering. I mean, just look at Afghanistan. There's a gender apartheid happening there, which is insane. Nevertheless, Kosovo is completely different because it has been, despite being a small country, historically, this country and this nation has played a historical role in defending what we call Western civilizations. So practically, if you just go outside my office, you will see that there is a statue of our national hero, Gjergj Kastrioti. Hundreds of years ago, he was the person that defended what we call the last port of Europe, defended what at that time was called Christian civilization, what today is known as Western civilization. So for centuries, Kosovo has been a place where, there, as you said, there were a lot of clashes, but we've always, well before Kosovo was Kosovo, well before Yugoslavia existed, we defended these Western civilizations. And for that reason, right after the war, this was a nation not just grateful, but a nation that believed in the same values that your men and women in uniform who came as our saviors believed in: the power of freedom and independence and human rights and equality. So when you share the same values and you walk each and every step together with your saviors, the Americans and the Europeans and others, it's so much easier to move towards, building a resilient country that has the same beliefs, share the same beliefs. Now, in some countries in the Middle East, that's not necessarily the case. It's a different culture, it's different beliefs. I'm not saying that they don't share many of our values, quite the opposite. We have great relations with most countries in the Middle East. Nevertheless, in the case of Kosovo, there was this, I would say, just very natural cooperation with the international community, and walking shoulder to shoulder in the past 25 years has been just the most natural thing, which is why even after 25 years, the support that we have for NATO and for the United States is at a historical height.
And we've talked about the positive impact NATO's had on Kosovo. You obviously have a statue of Bill Clinton, and I think you have a boulevard or a street named after Bill Clinton. Is that correct?
Yes, it's very close here. It's in Pristina. It was built right after the war because Bill Clinton was the president that decided on the NATO intervention. And then, as you rightly pointed out, we declared independence when Republicans were in power, and we worked with so many Republicans who are today back in office. I mean, I meet so many of them that served in Kosovo in 1999 that had such a fundamental role in saving our lives. Everywhere I walk in the halls of Congress, I meet someone who served in our country and made sure that we are free and our lives are saved. So the gratefulness is absolutely towards both sides of the aisle. And we want to work closely with the current government, with President Trump's administration, because I think that this is an alliance that is strong, it's solid, but at the same time with so much potential to do more things in the future.
I want to contrast that to Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine. There's a sign that I saw from my window, a big sign in the main street called Free Ukraine with the Ukrainian flag. So obviously we understand Kosovo's stance when it comes to Ukraine war. You clearly stand with Ukraine. But what are your thoughts on the eastward expansion of NATO over the last few years, especially after the dissolution of East and West Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall? NATO arguably made the promise to Russia that they would not expand 1 inch eastwards, and then we saw that constantly. They broke that promise. Do you think that was the right decision by NATO, and how big of a role do you think it played in Putin's decision in invading Ukraine?
Look, I mean, there's this basic principle that a sovereign nation decides on itself whether it wants to join an alliance or international organization. After all, the freedom to enter into international relations is one of the main features of statehood. So if you're denied the right to decide whether you want to join, let's say, NATO, or you want to join BRICS, or you want to join whatever alliance that you wish, or that your people support through democratic means, you are being denied one of the most important features of statehood. So I think
NATO could deny their because NATO played a role in influencing them to join NATO. I think they had a lot of presence there. How much influence is arguable, but it's a responsibility for NATO whether to accept Ukraine or not. And if Putin said, look, for it's a security risk for Ukraine to join NATO. If you look at the Monroe Doctrine in the US, if you had a military base in Mexico, I think the US wouldn't be too happy as well. Do you think it's a fair argument that, I'm not saying that's a pro-Russian argument, but I think it's a critical argument to make against NATO's expansion eastwards, or do you disagree?
I would disagree for some very simple facts. First, if we look historically, NATO has never invaded Russia or tried to attack Russia. Quite the opposite. From 1939 onwards, Russia has invaded the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. They've waged wars on Chechnya. They've invaded and then reinvaded, and then Ukraine would become practically for 400 years. They would invade Ukraine, and then Ukraine would reinstate its freedom and sovereignty, and then they would invade it again. So as you know, Russia and Ukraine had international agreements that were guaranteed by the US and other Western powers, based on which Ukraine would give up its nuclear powers, and also it would not join NATO, that Russia would respect its territorial integrity. But despite of these guarantees, Russia still did not respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, and it annexed Crimea in 2014. So practically after 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, we can't really talk about agreements of the past any longer. In international law, if one party withdraws or violates its part of obligations, then the other party is not obliged to respect them either. But again, this, I think, is mostly a decision of the people and the democratic institutions of each country. I've never seen, at least based on my experience, you might think otherwise, obviously, but that NATO forces or influences someone to join them. Quite the opposite. I think they make it too difficult, because we've been wanting to join NATO for quite some time, but they find a reason.
It's harder for Kosovo because some EU countries still don't recognize Kosovo's sovereignty.
Correct. But I when there's political will, there's always a way. So if there was political will among some of the main NATO countries, they could have convinced the 4 out of 32 that Kosovo's presence in NATO, Kosovo's membership, as well as Bosnia-Herzegovina's membership in NATO, is actually a geostrategic interest of the alliance itself, because the more NATO territory in the Western Balkans, the more safe and secure it is, and the more we can, reject foreign adversaries and malign influence in this region. So, in that sense, I think it's a very complex process, of course, politically, because in terms of technical criteria, we fulfilled them a long time ago. But I do recognize that the war between Ukraine and Russia is much more complex than what happened in Kosovo, because after all, when it comes to Russia, we're talking about a nuclear power. Here, we weren't talking really about a nuclear power. So Milosevic was unfortunately a powerful dictator. However, it was very easy for an alliance such as NATO to resist him without causing further damage. So the impact of the NATO intervention at that time has been, as I said, immensely positive. Now, I do know that there are efforts underway for a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, initiated by President Trump, which we fully support. Because what is mostly important, especially as president of Kosovo and growing up in a country that went through so much suffering, is that President Trump is showing so much empathy for human suffering. Now, every single time when he talks about Ukraine and Russia, he's talking about the people who are being killed. And the moment a leader puts human suffering as the centerpiece of its decision-making, that's when peace is possible. So I'm very confident that these talks will produce an agreement that would produce then a ceasefire, and hopefully we can take it from there. And whatever we can do as Kosovo to help, especially for post-construction in Ukraine, because, as you know, we're one of the most successful countries in terms of post-war building, we would be more than happy to support them.
But also Trump has been very critical of NATO. What do you think of that stance? And and also that kind of goes to another question. Like, NATO was built to counter the Russian threat. But if you see the relation between Russia and the US improving, do you think NATO continues to be a necessary alliance?
Absolutely, because look, just a few days ago, the new DNI published their new reports on the annual threats report. And obviously, Russia is one of the threats in that report, but the number one threat is China. Now, why is it important to maintain NATO? Because it's a values-based alliance. It's an alliance of countries that believe in the same values and defend each other whenever an adversary, whether that is Russia or China or some other power, would want to threaten us in any way possible. Now, we're not talking only about traditional wars any longer. The hybrid threats and all kind of threats that might come from China will pose such a national security threat to the United States and to the rest of us that we need each other in order to protect the systems that we've built throughout the past couple of decades, especially. So I believe that NATO will be there, especially with its power to protect us from cybersecurity attacks and so on. So we're not talking just about traditional war. We're talking about an alliance that will protect our values-based system from all of the modern threats that exist today. That's the first thing. Secondly, look, President Trump has been criticizing the countries that have not met the spending threshold on defense. I completely agree with that criticism. I think that it is imminent that countries that are member states meet that deadline. Look, we're not a member state, but we've met the 2% deadline well before the countries that are members of NATO. And we're planning in just a few years to double that. So we're at 2% right now. We're going to go to 4% very, very soon, aiming at 5% before most of the NATO member states. And I think that should serve as an example to NATO member states, because safety and security is a fundamental precondition to our prosperity. You cannot talk about economic development. You cannot talk about making sure that you stop the malign influence of China if you're not safe. Because when you're not safe, if you're attacked either through traditional warfare or hybrid threats, you cannot prosper economically. So I fully agree with President Trump's assessment that countries need to step up. And this has been quite a wake-up call for many countries. And I think it's the way to do it, because sometimes, a little bit of shaking is important and it's necessary and it's imminent in order to make sure that historic decisions are taken. Look at Germany. They're taking historic decisions to increase their defense spending. And that is important not just for them, but for all of us. And the more countries we have meeting this threshold, the better for the alliance, not just for the US, it's better for themselves to begin with. So we fully share that assessment.
So I've got a few questions on this. To kind of finalize a question on NATO's expansion eastwards, do you think, though, it played a role in the invasion in Putin's mind? And I want to link that to what they call the Kosovo precedent, because Putin did reference Kosovo in 2014 before annexing Crimea and the Donbass, and in 2022, even before the invasion. I've got his exact quotes. I'm sure you know them already. Western countries, as Putin in 2014, Western countries recognize the cessation of Kosovo from Serbia as legitimate, but we are not allowed to do the same for Crimea. What is this if not double standard? And then 2022, he said the leading Western countries once recognized the cessation of Kosovo from Serbia as legitimate. Do we not have the same right to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk? So my question is two parts. One is kind of repeating the first one, is whether it played a role in Putin's mind in invading Ukraine, whether he was worried about NATO's expansion. And second, your thoughts on the Kosovo precedent that Putin has mentioned a few times to justify his invasion.
Perhaps because we lived under a dictatorship and a genocidal regime which had this imperialistic and hegemonic approach. I'm talking about Milosevic. We know a dictator when we see one. I'm very much certain that the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is because of this historic imperialistic mindset that existed. If we go all the way to Catherine the Great, who used to say the more you invade, the more you can get, because at least at the end you will be left with some part of the other country's territories. So I think Putin simply wants to go back to his imperialistic appetites rather than, any fear that he might have from NATO. Fear from what? He was never attacked by NATO. Never. Not even 1 inch of Russian territory was attacked by NATO. There was an opportunity offered by many American leaders with Russia to cooperate based on certain principles, but there was never an intention by NATO to attack Russia. Now, of course, there are always economic wars and trade wars. That's a completely other question. However, NATO as a political military alliance has not threatened Russia in any way whatsoever so far. So in that sense...
having the bases is not a threat in your opinion, having all these missile defense systems on the border. So I'm sure if China has those bases around the US in Latin America, wouldn't the US see that as a threat? Again, going back to the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, the point is, if NATO has its bases, let's say, in the Baltics, that is because of the historic attacks, so since 1939 onwards, that Russia had made against the Baltic countries. So these countries, despite being NATO member states, they need support. We're talking about small countries that constantly have problems in the border with Russia, the same way that we have problems in the border with Serbia. So if there is no NATO presence in these countries, it would have been very difficult to prevent wars on NATO soil, which is why they are there. But that doesn't mean that they've ever attacked any inch of Russian territory. Now, getting back to what they call the Kosovo precedent, look, this is pure propaganda for a number of reasons, but that's what they know to do best in Russia as well as in Serbia. But let me mention a couple of reasons. First of all, compared to Donbass, compared to Donetsk, compared to Ukrainian territories, compared to Moldovan and Georgian territories, which Putin has illegally annexed. In the case of Kosovo, unlike these territories, we were an equal constituent unit of former Yugoslavia that had the right to decide our own fate, which they didn't. According to the Ukrainian constitution, these territories did not have the right to decide based on self-determination, which we did.
Kosovo did, because Kosovo was not a republic, it was an autonomous region, so it was a bit different to the others, no?
No, it was different only in name, but not in competences. If you look at the 1974 Constitution of Yugoslavia, it gave us equal rights to the republics, 1, and 2, that same constitution had provided that should there be a dissolution of Yugoslavia, the constituent units, and we were a constituent unit, would have this right to define their own fate. So legally we had that right too.
Define own fate isn't declare independence.
Exactly. We had define your fate. That means use your right to self-determination to decide whether you want to be independent or something else.
Okay.
Yes. Secondly, we did have a referendum for our independence in 1991, which was voted by more than 90% of the people of Kosovo. Thirdly, a genocide happened by the Milosevic regime against the people of Kosovo. Did Ukraine commit genocide against Donbass or Crimea? No. Did Moldova commit genocide against people in their territory? Never. Did Georgia commit genocide against people in their territory, which was annexed by Russia? No. So there is absolutely no comparison. And finally, the case of Kosovo is not a case of secession. It's a case of dissolution. In international law, independence that arises from constituent units after a dissolution of a federation is very well known. USSR was a federation and there are a lot of independent countries that stemmed from it. Yugoslavia was a federation and there are a number of independent countries that now stem from it. So there's a complete difference between the two. There's no Kosovo precedent, because in the case of Kosovo, the intervention was to stop the ongoing genocide. In the case of Russian invasion of these territories, it's a typical annexation without a reason. a typical annexation. So Russia did not annex these territories to save those people from genocide, unlike in the case of Kosovo, which is the reasoning and the justification behind the action. And of course, the only thing that resembles and that is the same in between the two cases is that the crimes that Milosevic committed against us are the same kind of crimes that Putin is committing against innocent people in these annexed territories and during the invasion of Ukraine. So yes, that is similar. Putin and Milosevic are similar, but there's no similarity between Kosovo and the annexed territories. So they have absolutely no justification or arguments to talk about a precedent that Kosovo has created.
What are your thoughts? You talked about China becoming more of a threat. I think it's a very fair statement. And there's been talks, and I've even mentioned it a few times. I put a post, I called it unpopular opinion. I said, strategically, an alliance, not just normalization of relations, but an alliance between the US and Russia, like, back during World War II, is something that's becoming more and more of a possibility, especially with how fast Trump is moving. First, do you think that is a possibility? Second, what is your stance on such an alliance between the two countries? And third, would you be open, obviously Kosovo is not a NATO member, but do you think NATO should be open to Russia potentially joining NATO? I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but no one would have expected what's happening in Greenland, what's happening in Panama, and how fast the negotiations are going about the Ukraine war. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that. And the reason I said that is, again, when it comes to China, that is a bigger security threat to the US. If you go back historically as well, Putin was seen as pro-US. He was the first president to call George Bush after 9/11. He was open to joining NATO back in 2001, I think it was. I don't have the quote there that he said on his Charlie Rose interview. When he was asked that question, he also opened his airspace to NATO when they were bombing Afghanistan. So he was seen a lot more pro-US back in the 90s and early 2000s than the Putin we're seeing now. So that's why I think it is a plausible scenario that Russia could end up allying itself with the US and NATO.
That's a very interesting question.
It is, yeah.
I actually never thought of a possibility of Russia ever becoming a member of NATO, perhaps because of recent history. However, look, how relations between the US and Russia would evolve, it will depend a lot on how quickly peace between Russia and Ukraine will be achieved. Now, what we see is that despite some positive signs, Russia has not accepted the peace proposal that was achieved in Saudi Arabia recently, but only parts of it. We're hoping that all of it would be accepted because it would save countless lives if a ceasefire is achieved. Whether we can go as far and think of such a strong alliance between the United States and Russia.
Germany's allied with the US. If I said that in the 50s.
Yeah, but it took a lot of time. Look, and there was quite a lot of repent from Germany. I always mention that example. I mean, what Germany did to convince the rest of the world that they belong among these democratic nations is immense. When Willy Brandt, at that time on behalf of Germany, apologized, he kneeled in front of the memorial of the Jewish people that were killed during Second World War. And he famously said, when journalists were asking him, why did you kneel in front of the memorial? He said, because that's what a human being does when you have no words. So people felt that repent, and they still feel it. And they don't condone of Hitler, they don't support it, they don't glorify what Hitler did. It's a completely different country today. Now, we don't see that in Russia. We don't see that in Serbia. The current president of Serbia glorifies Milosevic, calls him a great man with great intentions. So, I mean, I do hope that one day the president of Serbia or any politician there would find the strength to just, show a glimpse of humanity for the children killed, for the women raped, for the innocent people that were massacred. So I wouldn't go as far as thinking about Russia as a member of NATO. At least this time it seems quite close to impossible, but I think it will depend a lot on how relations between the United States and Russia evolve.
Do you think the world would have been a better place if NATO was more open to Russia joining back in the 2000s?
The world would
When
have
Putin showed
been
interest?
a much better place if Russia would have respected the basic principles of human rights and fundamental freedoms and would have respected its neighbors. And in this way, they would have met NATO criteria, and automatically that would mean that NATO would have been open to Russia. I think the reason why NATO is not open to Russia, but of course I can't speak on behalf of NATO because we're not a member, but this is just my opinion. The reason why NATO is not open to Russia today is not because they hate Russian people or they hate Russia per se, but it's because of what Russia does and what Russia doesn't do in terms of does not respect human rights and fundamental freedoms and basic principles of democracy and international law. Because if it was a different Russia that respects these principles, I'm sure that the doors of NATO would be open to it. So if one day Russia becomes that, then I'm sure that this values-based system, which NATO is, would open its doors for them. So this is not about hate or prejudice. This is just about what a country does or does not do.
Because I've got maybe two more questions on the Ukraine war. So when in the early days, President Putin was more open to Western values, and the Putin in the 2000s is different to President Putin today, especially with what's happening in Ukraine. So do you think there's also an argument to be made that NATO might have seen Russia joining the alliance a potential existential threat because it was created to counter a Russian threat? And if that threat is no longer a threat, then what's the purpose of having NATO? And obviously, you said it could be repurposed to target China, which is a really interesting idea. And then the second part of the question is, I'll let you answer that one first before I go to the second part.
Now, no matter the initial idea behind the creation of an international organization, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't evolve. You rightly pointed out the United Nations, when it was initially created, it was, to counter countries like Germany right after the Second World War, to make sure that they face justice, to make sure that there's no human suffering, such as the one that we saw during the Second World War. But today, Germany is one of the most respected members of the United Nations, is one of the countries that mostly contributes to peace and stability, not just in the European continent, but also in the world. So, of course, also this relationship between the UN and Germany has entirely changed to one of mutual respect rather than the one at the very beginning. Even if you just read the UN Charter, you would see how Germany was treated at those very beginnings. So I think, despite of the initial idea behind NATO, which was to counter Russian threat, to go back to what I said, if Russia were to respect the values based on which NATO was built, I'm talking about the values, respecting each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, no use of force against each other, no annexation, no illegal annexation, respect for fundamental rights and freedoms, and just fighting malign influence, with the key word being malign, not any kind of influence, but malign influence, countering threats that would attack this values-based system, then obviously I assume that also the position of NATO towards Russia would change. I don't think that they would be stuck on the initials of 75 years ago, but that they would evolve. I just don't think Russia gave them a reason to evolve. I think Russia did quite the opposite in the recent years.
The last question on the Ukraine situation is, one thing I've been critical of is, I feel sometimes NATO is not really incentivized to end the war. Now, I don't know, there's just so many different groups and organizations. I think President Putin said he does a deal with the president. He's seen many presidents. And then they agree on one thing, and then men in dark suits come back and everything changes. So I feel like there's, NATO's just not one holistic entity. There's all these different entities within it and within each member state as well, especially the US. So do you also feel, especially with Zelensky not agreeing to a peace deal in March 2022 and the Boris Johnson story of him influencing his decision when he was about to sign a deal, do you think that NATO should first, your thoughts on what happened in 2022. Second, do you think NATO's well incentivized to avoid conflict, the Middle East being another example that we won't have time to get into today?
I think the very clear thing is that the vast majority of influence within NATO is the United States. It's the biggest country, the one that also leads policy within NATO. Now, with President Trump really interested in achieving peace between Russia and Ukraine, I've seen the effects of that among other countries already. When I talk to leaders that are members of NATO, all of them, at least the ones that I've met, praised this initiative of President Trump. And I already see how much more incentivized NATO is to achieve peace. So I think it's about American leadership in most cases. So then, most of the other countries follow suits because they trust American leadership. So I'm very confident that there's a lot of progress that can be achieved in the days and months to come. Now, what happened in 2022, I don't really have a lot of details. There's a lot of speculation about what happened there. But on the other side, there's, some basic facts that happened in the ground. There was a full-scale invasion. People were being killed indiscriminately. They were losing their lives. And I'm talking about civilians. I'm not only talking about people that are fighting in the front line. And Putin had no reason to escalate to that level that would hurt civilians to the extent that we have seen right now. If the war would have been kept just in the front lines, it would have been different, and I think peace would have been achieved much quicker. But the fact that so much suffering was inflicted on civilians, on children, on women, on elderly, has made everything so difficult. Because for those of us that went through war, everything was being relived. And for NATO member states, this was a litmus test on whether this international law-based order should be protected or should we just close our eyes. So I think for most countries, rather than not being incentivized for peace, it was about not setting a bad precedent when you just close your eyes to such an invasion. We've seen in Georgia in 2008, its territory was annexed. Nothing was done, perhaps just a few short statements, but then no one ever mentioned it. It was important that something similar doesn't happen in Ukraine. So I think it was most about setting a standard of not allowing something like that to happen, rather than not being incentivized to have peace. Because look, so many of these European countries, through the sanctions and removing Russian oil and so on, they lost a lot economically. They lost a lot of energy deals. It's not like they were in a good position or comfortable position even in front of their people. So I wouldn't say that they were not incentivized for peace, but it was just so much was at stake. The entire rules-based order that was built right after World War II was at risk, and it was important that everyone fights to keep it strong, and that's what we saw, at least from our perspective.
Madam President, another topic I've been really looking forward to asking you about is USAID. It's covering the news, and it's honestly pretty bad press right now. And the whole perception of USAID, from people perceiving it as just an aid organization, which I think it's more than just aid, to now a lot of people, even in the US, just see it as an evil organization that only focuses on advancing US interests. So there's like two extremes. From one extreme is like a do-gooder that doesn't do anything but help the poor and the in need, to now just a CIA asset or tool. I've interviewed Presidents Fico, Vucic a few days ago, who were extremely critical of USAID. And President Kagame, who was a recipient of a lot of aid, Rwanda, after the genocide, but who was also surprisingly critical of USAID and the hooks that were attached with any aid that he's accepted, or even sometimes forced to accept certain aid that hurt his local industry and made his country dependent on aid until he slowly moved away. So I'd love to get your thoughts on USAID and all the press that you're seeing right now, especially considering Kosovo, I think, is one of the bigger aid recipients in the EU.
Well, we were certainly never forced to receive any aid. and USAID has played a pivotal role in Kosovo's post-war development. Initially, obviously, it was about rebuilding the country, building strong institutions, building democracy. And then it moved into projects that were mostly about economic empowerment and democratic resilience. So practically, I think the example of Kosovo is a good one because we called USAID's projects as a journey towards self-reliance. So, of course, we were not that dependent on USAID projects lately. At the beginning, we were very much so. We were because Kosovo is a country, as I said, that was born from the ashes. Everything was destroyed. So aid from the United States, from European countries, from countries all the way from the Middle East, or countries like Japan or Australia was essential. So countries all around the world came to help us to rebuild our lives and our country and our buildings. And everything was built from scratch. But then as time went by, this was mostly about building resilient institutions that can stand on their own feet, a country that can stand on its own feet economically. So a lot of the projects were very supportive of an economic environment that would protect U.S. businesses, of an economic system that is in line with U.S. standards, of an economy that is very inviting of cooperation with the United States in areas such as energy, which is essential, and then projects that would help us build a resilient system in terms of protecting ourselves from cybersecurity. And I think these kind of projects benefited both our countries. So it was a mutual benefit in terms of economic perspective, economic cooperation, as well as also defending the national security interests of the United States. Because we have a lot of U.S. presence here and we're hoping to have more U.S. businesses investing. It's important that Kosovo is a safe and secure country, but also one that thrives economically. Now, having said that, I do understand the fact that the U.S. government has a lot of criticism on certain projects. We didn't have the kind of projects that, were mentioned that would push forward a certain agenda. So at least not that I'm aware of. So USAID was mostly here about economic empowerment, supporting commercial justice systems, supporting generally our justice system, which is very important. And building a very sound business environment, all of which I think are a mutual interest for both Kosovo and the United States. But I do understand that in some country there was a very dangerous agenda that was pushed forward. So I do understand the concern that exists among the American people. So the fact that many of the projects were looked at and were under review and were closed, I mean, we do understand that. I think now we're moving towards bilateral cooperation with the United States that is of mutual interest, that is not aid, but at the same time helps us and helps the United States through our strategic dialogue, where there can be a lot of investment, one in the defense industry, there can be investment in the energy sector, there can be a lot of investment in the information technology and AI sector. So there's a lot that we can do together. And as I said, Kosovo is a country with enormous potential. Given that we have free trade agreements with the entire European continent, not just EU, but the rest, practically investing in Kosovo is not just investing in the Kosovo market, but in the market of hundreds of millions of Europeans. So imagine working with the most pro-American country on earth, the youngest population in Europe who are tech-savvy, multilingual, the best international financial system, all in line with American standards, and a sound justice and economic system that was built with the support of American aid from the U.S., the American people. I think all of this is at the benefit of both. So I do understand the criticism. In the case of Kosovo, we haven't had such projects that would aim to spread a dangerous agenda. In Kosovo, many of the decisions that were taken by President Trump are fully supported because, look, we're talking about quite a conservative society here as well. So the values that he represents and the decisions that he undertakes are absolutely supported. So even in terms of USAID, Of course, it's a decision of U.S. institutions, but we're looking into ways how we can really work together on projects that are about economic empowerment, investment, and national security. But these are things from which the U.S. would develop as well, would benefit as well, and they would serve the three purposes that the Secretary of State mentioned: to make America safer, more secure, stronger, and more prosperous. So, and we're presenting these kind of projects to the U.S. government already.
But you are dealing with a very different US to the one you dealt with in 1999 and afterwards, Obama, even Bush. President Trump has been extremely critical of the EU. He's been critical of NATO. His relation with Russia is very different to that of Biden. How are you adapting to Trump's America, especially when it comes to the EU? Kosovo is trying to join the European Union, but the European Union is coming under a lot of criticism. I'm sure you've heard the speech by J.D. Vance as well.
Yes, I was there.
Oh, there you go. So I think we'd love to get your thoughts on it.
The United States has given a historic contribution to a Europe whole, free, and at peace. It's a contribution that no one can ever erase, no one can ever put into question. And I think because of that historic contribution that brought freedom to Europe, the United States has every right to also speak up when there are certain things that they believe are not based on the values that they trust and the beliefs that they share. So I don't think that either Vice President J.D. Vance's speech or the constant statements that we hear from President Trump are in any way endangering Europe. Quite the opposite. I think it's a wake-up call for Europe to start working more on its defense capabilities, and in this way to also defend its own interests. I don't think that long-term the relationship between Europe and the United States is at risk. Simply, President Trump has a different way of doing things, has a different approach to resolving problems. And sometimes that turns out to be more successful than what we have seen in the past. So I'm very certain that he will continue his commitment to NATO. The transatlantic relationship is important to all of us, but both parties need to contribute to that. I mean, you mentioned Slovakia. Slovakia should have aligned its foreign policy with the United States when the United States recognized Kosovo as an independent and sovereign country. So should have Romania and the few other countries. By not recognizing the Republic of Kosovo, these few European countries are endangering peace and stability in the entire Western Balkans. Whereas the U.S. has given a historic contribution to a region where, let me take an example. I have twin daughters. They are 11 years old. They are the very first generation. The children of today are the very first generation in the history of our nation that are growing up in peace and have not known war. Our great-great-great-grandparents went through a war. Our great-grandparents went through a war. Our grandparents went through a war. Our parents went through a war. And we went through a genocidal war. It's the very first generation of children now that has not known war. And we need to keep it that. That is a historic achievement. In a region that has never known peace, we now live in peace because of American leadership. Because of American leadership. So when America comes to Europe with a wake-up call, we should take it very, very seriously, because it's mostly in our interest to make sure that our children never have to go through what we had to go through in the past. So peace is something that must be preserved. You need to work constantly to make sure that it survives. And in that case, I don't think Europe can make it without the support of the United States. So we need to work together. We need to be a little bit more open to criticism, but we need to find ways how to resolve these issues rather than just be angry. So I think more and more European countries are being open to resolving these issues, and the fact that they have announced that they will increase defense spending, most of which will also be announced at the June summit of NATO in the Netherlands, it's a very, very welcome sign. And of course, that is a result to most extent, in fact, to the approach that the new administration is taking. So it's like, it might sound hurtful at the beginning, but at the end, I think we will all be grateful with the results that are achieved.
Did you worry after you saw what the EU has done in Poland, Hungary, and more importantly, Romania with Ceausescu? In Romania, obviously, they've just played a role in cancelling an entire election. Whether you like Ceausescu or not, I think that goes against democratic values that Kosovo stands for. And in Poland and Hungary, whenever a country was looking at focusing at its own interests and that did not align with the EU, for example, when it comes to immigrants, the EU was not happy and they used economic sanctions to kind of put that country back in line. Do you think that was did that worry you as a country trying to join the EU? And do you think that the EU should also be careful not to cross certain boundaries? And they've crossed them.
One of the first letters that I signed after I was elected president was to the president of Poland, giving him my full support for the action that he was undertaking in supporting his country from what was going on at the border. It was an imminent danger, not just in Poland, but all of Europe. So we need to protect our borders. We have similar problems in the border with Serbia, where we've had a number of paramilitary attacks, but with the support of our allies, we've managed to thwart them successfully. But we know what it means to protect your borders. That should not be seen as a radical thing. That is a national security threat. We should all, meet this challenge successfully. So Poland is a country with which we develop very friendly relations, and we have supported the way how they have dealt with this issue, while at the same time, as you know, they've increased their spending in defense, which is, I think, quite a role model for so many of us. When it comes to
Romania is a big one.
Romania, I mean, it's It will be very important to read the Constitutional Court decision, and I'll be very honest with you, I haven't yet to see what was the justification that they used. I know what was said publicly in the media, and mostly they were talking about this, Russian influence through TikTok and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, the dangers of malign actors through TikTok are something that are recognized also in the United States, as you know, a decision, I think it's upcoming April, if I'm not mistaken. So these are things that depend on a number of factors. Illegal foreign interference in an election is something that is prohibited in international law and practice. And I think if that has been confirmed, it's something that should not happen anywhere in the world. Whether it has happened to the extent that would justify a Constitutional Court decision or not, I don't think it's my place to comment on that, because I don't know the details of that. However, I mean, the Romanian people, I trust that by exercising their will, they will know how to do it best, because it's a very well-established democracy. It's a long-term democracy. So, and Hungary is a country with which we share historic relations. I mentioned our national hero, George Castrioti. He fought alongside the Hungarian national hero, János Hunyadi, to defend at that time the last port of Europe and of Western civilization. So we share centuries of great relations, and sometimes we might have different views, but I think it's something that we can certainly overcome.
The last question is a bit more personal. Maybe the last couple of questions is there's a quote that you said that I read online, where you quoted saying you sometimes still feel the barrel of an M70 that a soldier forced into your mouth when your house was raided as a teenager during the war in 1999. Can you tell me more about some of those memories, to just explain to the audience what was going on in Kosovo and what you went through personally before the US intervened?
One of my first memories is oppression. It's I don't remember even one moment in my childhood where we did not feel oppressed. Because the pressure from, at that time, Serbia started quite early on, and I was very, very young, even before I started going to school. When it was felt in the streets, it was felt by the fact that Both of my parents were kicked out of their jobs just because of their nationality. I was a first grader when we were kicked out of our schools. Because of the solidarity among the people of Kosovo, people would give up their houses and they became house schools. So we would gather in these houses that were mostly hidden, because if the police would find us that we're actually going to school and still studying, they would start using violence. I remember this time when we went to a house which was quite hidden, all around with trees. And then in the middle of our history class, there was a police raid and they started beating up our teachers, and they arrested them afterwards. And of course, also beating up students, and we were running. So practically
just for teaching Albanians, that's it?
Just because we were going to school. So going to school for them was a crime. I was 7 when I was slapped in my face by a police officer just because I was carrying a book, although I was trying to hide it, to be very honest. So these are the kind of things that we lived with every single day. Going to school was a sacrifice that both kids and parents made. Our parents never knew whether we would go back alive, but it was also this ideal, because we know that through education, we were also fighting for freedom. Freedom to go to school was kind of the beginning of it. We wanted to be able to go to school, and they wouldn't let us do it. There was this basketball match once between a team from my hometown and a team from Pristina. And in the middle of the match, the police came in and they started beating up those basketball players in their knees. So, kids were not even allowed to go to the theater or play a basketball game. Basically, every basic human right was violated. And I'm not just talking about people that were politically involved. I'm talking about everyone. This involved everyone that was different, had a different nationality from Milosevic. It had nothing to do with religion, because the biggest massacre in Kosovo happened against the Catholics in the village of Meja, which we will commemorate in a couple of weeks.
Catholics.
Yes, Albanian Catholics. That's the biggest massacre that happened in Kosovo. So it had nothing to do with religion. They simply wanted to destroy a nation, no matter their religious beliefs.
Or an ethnic group within a nation.
Yes. And in that sense, growing up in such an environment obviously was very, very difficult. When all of our parents were kicked out of our jobs, it became very difficult to survive economically. But thankfully, we had diaspora around the world that helped us survive and kept us alive economically, although it was barely alive, to be very frank with you. But it was an apartheid-like system that was built. My father was a political prisoner. My grandfather was a political prisoner. They were tortured in prison. So I grew up having my father arrested and the police raiding our tiny little apartment in my hometown. And then during the war, of course, we had a number of horrendous all of the war was horrendous, to be very honest. Just seeing people that you love being killed. And we were forced to walk from Mitrovica, which is a city in the north of Kosovo, all the way to the border with Albania, which was 4 days of walking, 4 days and 4 nights of walking. And you could see, they would just take their guns and they would start shooting. So whoever was in the first lines would get killed. A lot of people died of hunger. A lot of people were killed. A lot of children died right after they were born. There were women just giving birth in the middle of the street. And it was raining all the time. It was very, very cold. We were sleeping outside. And it was not just that time, but throughout those months, we were internally displaced, because immediately when the war started, we were kicked out of our apartment, just like other Albanians. We were forced to leave our houses. So we were hiding in the mountains for a time. And then when we arrived at the border with Albania, we were forced to go back because we were being used as human shields. We were one of the few groups that still remained in Kosovo and did not become a refugee. And the Yugoslav army and police needed us as human shields so that NATO would not bomb their military bases. So it was a horrendous experience, but to be honest, at least we survived. I mean, so many. I lost some family members from my mom's side, and then some from my dad's side as well. But our closest family, my siblings and my parents, we survived. But if you go around, of course, our apartment was burned down. But at least we became refugees then in Montenegro. And we came back right after the war, but at least we were free. I mean, we had no place to sleep. It was all burned down, but we didn't have an automatic gun on our heads. No one was trying to come and kill us. So many women were raped during the war, young women. I have a special envoy, presidential special envoy, who's a survivor of sexual violence. She was 16. She was taken from her mom's arms, and she was raped over and over and over again. And at the end, the police told her, "We will let you live because that's how you suffer more." And then my special envoy on transitional justice, Shureta Tahiri, she was raped in front of her two daughters who were 3 and 1. Who does that? I mean, everywhere around Kosovo, the pain is so deep, but you will never, ever meet anyone that wants revenge. Only justice, no revenge. The mothers that are still searching for their missing children, those who lost all of their children and all of their family members. It's justice, peace, reconciliation, and just making sure, as I said earlier, that our children never have to go through what we had to go through. Just imagine, I went to bed every single night with the sound of firearms and thinking about, when are they coming to kill us? My daughters don't have to go to bed with these kind of sounds. So, I mean, when I tuck them into bed, every single night we talk about how blessed we are and how thankful we are that they have a cozy, warm bed, but most importantly, there's no war. When there is peace, everything else is possible. Everything else is achievable. Everything else is within reach, whether it's economic development or others. Which is why, despite of the fact that Serbia has never apologized, never shown a sign of repent for the crimes against innocent civilians, never put one of their war criminals behind bars, we have extended our hand of friendship. We have extended our hand of cooperation. We have accepted every agreement that was brokered by the United States and the European Union from 1999 onwards, because we are really committed to peace. We have no collective hate towards the Serbian people. We don't want collective responsibility. But those criminals, those individuals who have caused so much pain and suffering on the most innocent, on the infants, on the 6-month-old infants, they have to face justice. And I think that's the most humane thing that one can ask. And I would expect the president of Serbia to ask the same from those people who committed those crimes.
And do you have any lines of communication with President Vučić of Serbia?
So we do attend joint summits. That doesn't mean that we agree on the positions that we take. But we are in joint events quite often.
Do you speak to him often, maybe on the call, on phone calls?
No, that has not happened yet, not because Kosovo didn't want to, but quite the opposite, because Serbia has resorted to violence, and we had acts of aggression since September 2023, even before that, but the most serious one in September 2023, which is very serious because we didn't have such violence from Serbia in 25 years. And the fact that they're resorting to that is a sign that they want to go back to the past, whereas we want to look towards the future. And then we have this dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia that takes place in Brussels, where there are constant negotiations on issues of practical importance, freedom of movement, of people, of goods, how we define the fate of the missing persons, and issues of, different kinds of issues, more than 90 documents so far that have been reached in the past 14 years. But regretfully, most of them have not been implemented by Serbia, so they remain pieces of paper. However, we do remain fully constructive and committed to the dialogue because we think that's the only way to achieve everlasting peace and prosperity for our region. Look, the current and future generations, whether in Kosovo or in Serbia or in Albania, in Montenegro, in this region, they deserve a future where they can live in peace based on the principle of good neighborly relations, where neighbors respect each other, and where we can prosper and join the European Union and join NATO as values-based systems in which we believe. I know that Serbia is not ready for that yet. I do hope that that will change, because that would be at the benefit of the entire region, not just at the benefit of the Serbian people. So we hope that all of us in the Western Balkans would move forward towards these values-based systems and really work in a way that we never, ever go back to what we've seen and what we've lived in the past.
I couldn't disagree with that. Madam President, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure talking to you.